The war was supposed to be almost over. By early 1968, Americans were told that the enemy was weakening, that progress could be measured, and that victory was only a matter of time. Then, in January, everything changed. During the Tet holiday, when fighting was expected to pause, attacks erupted across South Vietnam. More than 100 targets were hit at once. Cities, towns, and military bases came under fire. Even Saigon was no longer off limits. This wasn't a conventional defeat. On the battlefield, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces would eventually regain control and inflict massive losses. Yet, Tet exposed a brutal contradiction, a tactical victory that turned into a strategic collapse. If the war was being won, how could it explode everywhere at the same time? And if official assurances were true, why did this moment feel like the beginning of the end? To unswear that, we need to go back to the years before Tet. Between 1965 and 1967, the Vietnam War entered its most intense phase of American escalation. What began as an advisory mission transformed into a full-scale ground war, with U.S. troop levels rising from a few thousand to more than 400,000 by the end of 1966. The central logic guiding Washington was the war of attrition. U.S. commanders believed that superior firepower, air dominance, and industrial capacity would slowly grind down North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces until they could no longer replace their losses. Victory, in this view, was not territorial or political, but mathematical. Whoever exhausted the other first would prevail. This assumption shaped nearly every operational decision made by the U.S. military during these years. At the heart of this strategy was the belief in the so-called crossover point U.S. military leadership, particularly within the Military Assistance Command. Vietnam, MAC, argued that there would come a moment when enemy losses would exceed their ability to recruit and infiltrate new fighters into the South. General William Westmoreland repeatedly assured civilian leaders that this point was approaching. Internally, however, intelligence estimates showed continued infiltration from the north at levels that contradicted public optimism, even as enemy troop strength appeared resilient. Official briefings emphasized progress, kill ratios, and statistical indicators designed to show momentum in America's favor. The war was being measured, but selectively. This disconnect fed what historians later called the optimism campaign. Throughout 1966 and 1967, the Johnson administration and senior military leaders made coordinated efforts to reassure the American public that success was near. Press conferences in Saigon, often referred to cynically as the 5 o'clock follies, highlighted positive metrics while minimizing setbacks. General Westmoreland became the public face of this narrative, testifying before Congress and appearing in national media to argue that enemy forces were weakening and that the end of the war was visible. Yet internal requests for additional troops and concerns about enemy strength told a far more uncertain story behind closed doors. At the same time, Vietnam became the first true television war journalists were embedded with units and had unprecedented access to combat operations. Nightly news broadcasts brought graphic images of fighting, destruction, and casualties directly into American living rooms. This visual reality increasingly clashed with official statements of steady progress. As reports from the battlefield showed intense and unrelenting combat, public trust began to erode. Polls reflected growing skepticism, and protests against the war expanded across college campuses and major cities. The gap between what Americans were told and what they saw widened steadily. By late 1967, the United States stood at a crossroads. It refused to publicly acknowledge. Militarily, it was deeply committed, with hundreds of thousands of troops deployed. Politically, it was invested in the claim that the war was being won. Psychologically, however, both the public and parts of the government were uneasy. The conditions were set for a shock so powerful that it would expose these contradictions all at once. That shock would arrive not through defeat in the jungle, but through surprise in the cities during a holiday meant for peace. If this story is helping you understand how the Vietnam War reached this moment of tension and contradiction, take a second to support the channel. Leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on notifications helps us keep breaking down history with depth, clarity, and evidence. Because the carefully constructed narrative of progress is about to collide with a single event that exposed the war's reality in a way no briefing ever could. The Tet Offensive was not designed as a conventional military campaign aimed at holding territory. From its conception, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong leaders understood that defeating U.S. forces outright on the battlefield was unlikely. Instead, the offensive was built around a political and psychological objective to shatter American confidence, destabilize the South Vietnamese government, and expose the fragility of U.S. claims that victory was near. Hanoi believed that if the illusion of progress collapsed, the political will sustaining the war would follow. In that sense, Tet was less about winning battles than about breaking narratives. The timing of the offensive was central to this strategy. Tet, the Lunar New Year, was the most important holiday in Vietnam and had traditionally been accompanied by ceasefires or reduced fighting. In late 1967, Viet Cong forces publicly announced a truce for the holiday, reinforcing expectations of calm. Behind the scenes, however, North Vietnamese planners used the holiday to mask large-scale troop movements and weapons infiltration. Civilian travel during Tet provided cover for guerrilla fighters to enter cities and position themselves near key targets. When the attacks began on January 30th and 31, 1968, the element of surprise was nearly total. The scale of the offensive stunned both military commanders and the public. Approximately 70,000 to 100,000 North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong fighters struck more than 100 cities, towns, and military installations across South Vietnam. Provincial capitals, district headquarters, and major urban centers were all hit simultaneously. This was not a localized uprising, but a nationwide assault. For a war that had been described as increasingly under control, the sudden eruption of combat everywhere at once was psychologically devastating. Even where attacks failed quickly, their mere occurrence contradicted years of official assurances. Nowhere was the symbolic impact greater than in Saigon. Although the assault on the U.S. Embassy compound was militarily insignificant and quickly repelled, the image of enemy fighters breaching its outer walls carried enormous weight. The embassy had long been portrayed as the most secure symbol of American power in South Vietnam. Footage and photographs of fighting at its gates circulated worldwide, reinforcing the perception that no place was truly safe. The message was not that the United States was losing tactically, but that it did not control the war in the way it claimed. The Battle of Huc further deepened this perception. Unlike most Tet engagements, which ended within days, fighting in Huc lasted nearly a month. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces seized much of the city, including its ancient citadel, and engaged in brutal urban combat with U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese troops. The battle caused massive destruction and heavy casualties on both sides. Reports later documented executions of civilians by communist forces during their occupation. Although Allied forces eventually retook Huc, the prolonged fighting contradicted the narrative of enemy weakness and highlighted the high human cost of the war. From a strictly military standpoint, the Tet Offensive was a failure for North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces regained all lost territory, inflicted enormous casualties on attacking units, and severely damaged the Viet Cong's infrastructure in the south. Thousands of experienced guerrilla fighters were killed, weakening the insurgency for years to come. By conventional metrics, territoria held, enemy losses, and battlefield control, the United States and its allies emerged victorious. Yet these facts struggled to compete with the power of what Americans had seen and heard. What made Tet decisive was not what happened on the ground, but how it reshaped perception. The American public had been told repeatedly that the enemy was on the brink of collapse. Tet demonstrated that the enemy could still coordinate nationwide attacks, strike major cities, and sustain intense combat. The credibility gap already present before 1968 became impossible to ignore. Media coverage emphasized the scale and surprise of the attacks rather than their ultimate failure. For many Americans, the question shifted from "how do we win?" to "why were we told we were winning?" Inside the U.S. command structure, Tet forced a moment of reckoning. Classified assessments produced after the offensive acknowledged that victory was not imminent and that previous optimism had been overstated. Senior commanders privately recognized that the war was far more resilient and complex than public statements suggested. This admission was reflected most clearly in what happened next. Rather than declaring success, military leaders requested massive reinforcements. In the weeks following Tet, General Westmoreland asked for tens of thousands of additional troops, even as public confidence collapsed. These requests exposed a stark contradiction. For months, the American public had been told that enemy manpower was nearly exhausted and that the war was approaching a favorable conclusion. Yet the immediate response to Tet was a call for escalation on a scale that implied the opposite. Internally, commanders argued that only with additional forces could they regain the initiative and prevent future large-scale offensives. Politically, however, such requests were increasingly untenable. The gap between rhetoric and reality had become visible not just to critics, but to policymakers themselves. The political consequences were swift. President Lyndon B. Johnson faced declining approval ratings, intensifying anti-war protests, and growing dissent within his own administration. Tet undermined confidence in his leadership and his handling of the war. Rather than approving full-scale troop increases, Johnson announced limits on U.S. forces and ordered a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam. These decisions marked a clear shift away from escalation and toward even if publicly framed as strategic adjustments rather than retreat. Tet also altered the long-term trajectory of the conflict. Although fighting continued for years, the offensive changed the fundamental goal of U.S. involvement. After 1968, American leaders increasingly sought a way out of Vietnam rather than a decisive military victory. Negotiations, previously secondary to battlefield success, became central to strategy. In Tet functioned as a catalyst. It did not end the war, but it ended the belief that the war could be won on the terms that had been promised. The battlefield remained contested, but the war for credibility had been decisively lost. The Tet Offensive did not defeat the United States on the battlefield. American and South Vietnamese forces held their ground, reclaimed every major position, and inflicted devastating losses on the Viet Cong. Yet Tet accomplished something far more consequential. It destroyed the political and psychological foundation on which the war depended. For years, U.S. leaders had argued that victory was a matter of time, that the enemy was weakening, and that perseverance would bring success. Tet exposed that narrative as unsustainable. In doing so, it made continued escalation politically impossible. The central paradox of Tet defines its legacy. Militarily, it was a failure for North Vietnam. Strategically, it was a turning point against the United States. The offensive revealed that official claims of progress could not survive contact with visible reality. Attacks in Saigon, prolonged fighting in Huc, and coordinated strikes across South Vietnam contradicted years of optimistic briefings. The credibility gap already present before 1968 collapsed entirely. Once public trust was broken, no amount of battlefield success could restore it. Inside the U.S. government, Tet forced an internal shift. Private assessments acknowledged that the war was far from being won and that earlier optimism had masked deeper structural problems. Requests for massive troop reinforcements following the offensive made this contradiction undeniable. The same commanders who had spoken publicly of progress now admitted, behind closed doors, that victory required even greater sacrifice. Political leaders, facing public opposition and social unrest at home, chose a different path. Limits on troop levels, bombing halts, and the search for negotiations marked the beginning of disengagement. From this moment forward, the objective of U.S. policy changed. The question was no longer how to win the Vietnam War, but how to exit it without total collapse of credibility. Tet did not end the fighting, but it ended the illusion that military power alone could secure political victory. The war would continue for 7 more years, but it would do so under the shadow of January 1968. The legacy of Tet extends beyond Vietnam. It demonstrated that modern wars can be lost in perception even when they are not lost in combat. Information, imagery, and public trust became as decisive as troops and firepower. Tet was the moment the Vietnam War began to end, not because the United States was defeated, but because the truth could no longer be denied.